Hello, good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for a few people to arrive, but I think we have quite a lot of people here already. So very warm welcome to all of you to our webinar. And today we're going to be discussing language in the early years and how to support deaf children in developing countries. My name's Joanna Clark. I'm the Director of Deaf Child Worldwide. And Deaf Child Worldwide has been working with many different partners over the last 20 years. We work in South Asia and East Africa, and we used to also work in South America, in particular with deaf children living in low-income communities. So we hope through this webinar to share some of the learning and what we've learned with our partners over the years. And I'm also delighted to say that we are joined by a really excellent panel who are going to contribute their rich knowledge from Ghana, Bangladesh, India and Kenya, and we will be meeting them in a few minutes. Deaf Child Worldwide defines deafness as children with any level of hearing loss, which I know there are different definitions throughout the world, but for the purposes of today, when we say deaf or deafness, we're referring to children with mild, moderate, severe or profound hearing loss, which means that we're including some children with moderate and mild hearing loss and some children who can't hear at all. And when we're talking about language today, we're talking about either signed or spoken language, that interchangeably. We're also obviously talking about early years. And I know in a lot of contexts, early years usually refers to children aged 0 to 5. In fact, we're taking a more expansive definition of this because unfortunately, many of the children we work with would not have a diagnosis till much later than 5, or certainly somewhere in between 0 and 5 years old, which means that when we're talking about early learning, we might be talking about deaf children who are a bit older than their hearing peers are at an early learning age. I hope that's clear. Okay, so I'm just going to set a little bit of context before we get into discussion with the panel. And perhaps we should start by looking at children who are born deaf. A baby who's born deaf, just like a hearing baby, will have a natural drive to learn to communicate with others and pick up information from body language, from whatever amount of speech they can hear, and so on. But deaf babies will begin by developing their own special way of communicating, pointing at objects, using actions to demonstrate that they're hungry or tired. And if the child and their family have no opportunity to learn an official sign language, they'll probably develop their own system of home signs. And these informal signs and gestures can convey a surprisingly rich range of thoughts and feelings and actions. Some deaf babies, or babies who are born deaf, are born to deaf parents who already use sign language. So these babies begin the language journey as soon as they're born, first learning by touching and feeling, and then when their sight develops through seeing and understanding signs. And these babies will learn sign language in much the same way as hearing babies learn a spoken language. And they'll achieve similar milestones to hearing babies. But this is as long as they have frequent daily exposure to other fluent users of that language. Having said all this, the fact is that 90% of deaf babies and young children are born into or become deaf when they live in hearing families. And in the communities where we work, most of the children, the vast majority of children we work with, live with parents or families who have little or no information about deafness. Many parents don't know how to tell if a baby or small child is deaf. They might not understand why their child is not responding when they talk to them. And if parents don't know that their child is deaf, they often don't understand why their learning might be slower than expected. And even actually when they do know their child is deaf, they often don't know how to communicate with their child and don't know how best to support them. And possibly worst of all, there's often a feeling that they cannot learn. And there's an assumption that their child won't be able to learn. This is particularly troubling because the first 3 years of life are so important for learning language and communication. It's vital that families with deaf children get as much support as early on as possible, even if a formal diagnosis is difficult to obtain. And families need to be reassured that their deaf child can learn, and to understand that all deaf children have a right to learn in whatever way works best for them. Our partners work closely with families to help them understand deafness and to signpost them to services that exist, to reassure them that their child can learn, and to support families to learn how to communicate with their children in those critical early years. Delayed language in deaf children sadly can have many escalating consequences. Young deaf children can understandably become very sad and withdrawn, or very angry and frustrated when they can't express themselves or they can't understand what other people are trying to say to them. Delayed language also makes deaf children and young people more vulnerable to isolation and to bullying and to abuse. And in particular, deaf girls and young women can face the most acute challenges, as their education is often seen as a low priority, and they're at greater risk of child marriage, sexual exploitation, and all the negative impacts as well of a lack of sexual and reproductive health, education, and knowledge. Having very little language can have an enormous impact on deaf children's ability to achieve at school. And this is because a child cannot become literate without first knowing a language, whether this is sign language or a spoken language. The key focus of most primary education is teaching children to read and write, which means that when a deaf child starts school with very little language, he or she will find it almost impossible to keep up with their hearing peers. This is why it's vital to develop a young child's language as much as possible before school begins, and to support continuous language learning throughout the school years. It's important to stress that this delay is not because deafness is a learning disability. It's about lack of accessible language, and with the right support, a deaf child can learn and achieve alongside their hearing peers, but sadly, that support is often not forthcoming. So I hope that's just set a little bit of context for the rest of the webinar and our discussion. And I'm really pleased to let you know that we're now going to hear from our colleague, Rose Kwamboka. Rose is Deaf Child Worldwide's inclusion advisor at our office in East Africa, in Nairobi. Rose is herself deaf, so she's going to be working with her Kenyan Sign Language interpreter, George, who you can't see because he's in the room with Rose. And Rose will talk a bit about prelingual and postlingual deafness, a little bit about hearing technology, and then she's going to take us through 5 ways to help children develop early language. So thank you very much, Rose. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and I welcome everyone to the webinar on language and early years. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. My name is Rose Kwamboka. I'm the Inclusion Advisor with Deaf Child Worldwide, based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm going to share with you at least 5 ways that will help the deaf children acquire language during their early years. When we talk about language, we need to bear in mind that it can be any language, whether spoken or signed, depending on the level of deafness. However, before I begin, I would like to point out that deafness is not a learning disability. Deaf children can learn any language just like any other hearing children. The hearing children acquire language through hearing. However, the deaf lack what we call incidental learning. The incidental learning, this is where the children learn information, new words, pronunciations, and manners through hearing and observing other people. There are a few considerations that we're teaching deaf young children that I would like to address before I get to the 5 tips. The first one is young children who are not born deaf, but become deaf through maybe illness or accidents. These are categorized in 2 different ways. We have children who lose their hearing before they develop a language. Probably that is before the age of 3, and they are referred as prelingually deaf. They face the same challenges as children who are born deaf. Then children who become deaf after the age of 3 are referred to as the postlingually deaf. They still need support in order to continue learning and using spoken language. The other consideration is the role of the hearing technologies. Many children in the low-income or developing countries do not have access to any hearing technologies. If they do, it is effective. Its effectiveness will depend on how well it works for the type of deafness they have. If they use any kind of technology, it's most often the hearing aids. Only a tiny minority will use other types, such as cochlear implants or the bone conduction hearing devices. Continuous use of the hearing technology from early years allows the deaf children to make most of any residual hearing. They have to develop a spoken language and communication at the same level with their hearing peers. However, the benefits of having the benefits of the child will depend on how well the deafness has been diagnosed, the quality of the hearing aid, how they are fitted, how they are frequently, the molds and the aids are checked, and if a child gets access to speech and language therapies, this will help them interpret the sounds. For the hearing aids to be effective, they must be regularly checked. Batteries need to be changed regularly. The hearing aid must be kept clean, and it must be inserted correctly to the child's ear. In the absence of quality health and audiology services, our community-based programs help the children, the parents, the teachers to understand how hearing aids work, and how to use and maintain them. With that in mind, you can see why families prefer to use sign language to communicate with their children, especially those who are severe or profoundly deaf. When a young child learns sign language first, they can use the knowledge to build on any other language. For instance, English, French, Swahili, or Spanish later on in life. Deaf children can learn sign language as early as the age of 6 months. We'd like to encourage parents, the caregivers, the teachers to learn sign language. And when that is most suitable choice for the child, so that they can be able to communicate in the same language. There are many ways you can use to help the deaf child acquire a language. Now, let us get to the 5 tips. The first tip is repetition. It is important to start with something that the child is familiar with. For instance, milk. When you give a child milk, sign it to him or her and say the word clearly at the same time. At first, they will give you empty stares. They may not respond, but they will take the milk. The more you repeat, the more the child brain begins to process the information. And with time, they will start associating that sign and the lip pattern of the word with the sign milk. They may even attempt to sign it whenever they want milk. Continue adding new words each day when you're signing to the child. Make sure there's proper lighting so that the child can see the object that you're holding. Point to the bottle as you sign it and also say the word. This will help the child understand what you're saying. The second tip is the use of visual materials. Let's assume you want to teach the deaf child about fruits. You can use real-life objects such as orange, apple, banana, or lemon if you're going to teach the deaf child about the fruits. Milk is also a good example of a real-life object. Another visual material you can use are pictures of the fruits or drawings of the different types of fruits. Deaf children have different learning styles. Most of them are more likely to be visual learners. This is where they learn better by seeing. The third tip is to use everyday activities. For instance, digging, cooking, shopping, washing dishes, and clothes. Let the child take part in these activities and learn. Do not be afraid to explain to the deaf child, even if the language is challenging. They will start picking up with time. And if they don't understand what you're saying, try a different way to pass the message or rephrase what you're trying to say. You can use other methods to explain, for instance, pictures, drawings, demonstration, to help them get the message across. The fourth tip is to use sign language in the presence of a deaf child, even if you're not talking directly to them. If you're talking to someone else, use sign language, even if it does not concern the deaf child. This will help the child to pick up new words every day, and even might ask you what you mean when you sign this way. This is the incidental learning for the deaf children, and it will enhance their self-esteem when they feel, and they will also feel like they're part of something. And then lastly, but not least, reading of storybooks to the deaf child. Parents, teachers, caregivers should read storybooks to the deaf children in sign language and explore the instructions. Pick new signs, new words, and also encourage the culture of reading. Reading can help with the language acquisition, communication skills, social skills, and literacy skills. Reading or sharing of stories and storybooks will help on a daily basis, will help the deaf child become more vocabulary oriented and build their vocabulary. And it will also cover the lack of incidental learnings. I hope you have learned something. Thank you very much. Back to you, Joanna.
Great. Thank you very much, Rose, for all your insights. I think some really interesting points there for learning, and to think about the difference of challenges that deaf children who are born deaf and those who become deaf post-lingually face. And I think Rose also mentioned issues around hearing technology. Obviously, there's quite a range of hearing technology, but certainly with the communities that we work with mostly, who are low-income communities, there's very little access to quality hearing technology. And it's not just the hearing aids themselves or whatever, it's that there isn't the infrastructure there to support good use of hearing technology either very often. And I think really helpful for the 5 tips that Rose went through. And really it's, you know, a lot of it is perhaps common sense. It's what you would do with any child, but at the same time, quite often, I think people think that because the child can't hear, they might not do this in quite the same way. So really important to reinforce those messages. Thank you very much, Rose. I'm delighted now as well to move on to our panel discussion and to introduce our panel to you, and you can see them up there on the screen, and they'll be joining us here in person. So I'm really delighted to welcome our 4 panelists. Between them, a wealth of experience and expertise, and we have Daniel from Ghana, Shana from Bangladesh, Nita from India, and you've met Rose from Kenya. And before we actually get into the discussion, I'm going to ask each of you, please, to just spend a few minutes introducing yourselves. So, Daniel, if you could begin, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Fobi. I work as a lecturer in the University of Education, Winneba, and also I am the coordinator for an ongoing project on early education for young deaf children and their caregivers, which is a collaboration between the University of Education, Winneba, and the University of Leeds in the UK. Our goal on the project was to understand the language and communication of young deaf children and their caregivers within the Ghanaian context. We were particularly interested in this because, as Joanne said, most deaf children, about 90% of them, are born into families where there are no history of deafness or any support for deaf people within that context. So when this happened, the way the children communicate through language becomes challenging, and the infrastructural support that is available also need to be studied. So on our project, it is good to note that we had 100% of our caregivers to be hearing who have no history of deafness in their family, and we're having deaf children for the first time. Now, because there are no clear infrastructural supports, especially in early years, some of these children are identified as late as 9 years, and which practically means that they don't have language and need support. Rose mentioned early on that within this context, it's also difficult to have technological support in, for example, hearing aids available to these children. So as a project team, we're particularly interested in the kind of resources available to the caregivers in their homes and how they manage to communicate with the young children in early years. We were interested in this because over the years, we've seen in literature that not much attention has been paid to that, though the caregivers also have a way of supporting the language and communication of their young deaf children. So what we did as a project team was to see the kind of collaboration between health and education in supporting early years education for young deaf children, even before they start school. Starting school here, especially in the Ghanaian context, starts at age 4. But for most deaf people, just as I've mentioned, some of them are identified very late in life. And so they get to school maybe 5, 6, and even as old as 30 years. So as a project team, we were interested in the regular activities, just as Rose had mentioned, that caregivers do with their children, the sort of resources they use to support their communication and language. We did some videos with the caregivers interacting with their deaf children to examine how they support the children in their home. Then on the project, we also had deaf colleagues who are adults, working with them to understand the issues, especially in supporting us create resources that could support the language and communication of the children. So what we did through our colleagues who are deaf is, one, to produce some resources, multilingual resources, and it's worthy to note that within the Ghanaian context, we have over 79 different spoken languages, and also 3 different sign languages. Officially, we have the Ghanaian Sign Language. So most deaf people are born into family where there are multiple languages available. So in producing our resources, we were very particular about that to ensure that our resources were multilingual. So they were produced in sign language with English captions and voiceover. We also have some of them in our Ghanaian languages, especially in P, where people who watch the video could see captions, and on top of it, we also hear the languages that we have spoken in addition. So that is how we have supported our deaf children, and going forward, we are thinking of targeting the trainers so that we train the trainers and they could cascade this kind of training into the families to support the children, the teachers of the deaf, and ultimately support the deaf children. Thank you, and I'm happy to respond to questions when we open up the discussion.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Some really interesting points there, thank you. And I'm sure we'll have time to elaborate a bit on some of those. Could I ask Shana now, please, to introduce herself?
Hi everybody, it's lovely to meet you all. I'm Fauna, I'm based in Bangladesh, and I'm currently working on a project that is supported by DCW. In our project, we focus intensively on the language and communication development, also the pre-primary academic skill of deaf children for 3 to 6 years old. Let me share something about our project, the relationship between DCW and CDD, where the organization I work for is Center for Disability Development, CDD. So our relationship with DCW started back in 2014. Back then, we had 3 city centers in 3 different districts in Bangladesh. You know, each city center is the early childhood development center, but that is only focused on deaf children. So in our ECD center, we used to teach sign language. As Rose already mentioned, that sign language is the foundation of deaf children's speech. They will develop the other language on the based on the sign language. So we gave importance on teaching the students sign language, but also we used to provide informed choice to the parents. Like we are not telling the parents that sign language is the full and final solution of your deaf children for your deaf children, but we are showing them ways like you have this and this option available. What do you want to do? And the interesting thing is that some of the parents who are not really ready to accept sign language, they are like, okay, sign language is okay, but how can we use sign language publicly? I mean, nobody else is using sign language, so let us develop these skills of our children. Okay, who provided them with information linkage with speech therapy, and almost everybody at the end came back because sign language is really something. Well, taking from my own experience, I am a multilingual deaf. You already know about the three kinds of deafness from Rose's session. So I lost my hearing at the age of 7, and but by then I have already developed my speech. But and my first language is Bangla, second language is English, and third is sign language. But I myself regret not having access to sign language on time because it just opens a new door to all. Anyway, so in our ECD center, we undertook different kind of intervention. I think most of our interventions that match up with the tips that Rose shared. Like like these children, they learn from visual cue, and we just decorated our ECD center in such a way that these children will see the posters and other thing. We also tagged up PFD furniture in this city center. We encourage the parents to do the same at home, and so we use the teaching learning materials to teach deaf student concept and language. We also adapted lessons like to make them easy for deaf children. So, and finally, we made the individual plan for each deaf student. We tracked their progress. We tracked every we saw how the deaf students are like progressing, and we also involved the family members, the parents, the caregivers, and also the community teachers and everything. So together we tried to develop the language and other skill of deaf children. We are still doing it. Okay, so thank you all, and I'm really excited to see your question and ready to answer some of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shana. That's great. Really interesting points that you raised there. Could I ask Nita now, please, to introduce herself?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Joanna. And I'd like to welcome you all once again to this webinar on language in early years for deaf children. My name is Nita Gopalakrishnan, and I am a CODA, which means a child of deaf adults. I'm also the technical advisor on deafness and a senior lead trainer with Deaf Child Worldwide for over 6 years now. I'm based in Hyderabad, which is a state in India. So being a CODA, I grew up with my first language being sign language. And today I'm able to speak 5 languages. I've had many people actually ask me how I really learned language. How did I learn sign language? When my parents can't speak or hear, how did they teach me to speak? That's a question that I get very often. So I was exposed to sign language right from my birth, and all conversations at home was in sign language, which I, like any other child would do in their houses, where a spoken language is the used language at home. I imitated sign language, and then I started to understand by constant use, and then started to communicate in sign language. Just like any other child, like I said, who is exposed to hearing language or a spoken language, would first start to imitate, then understand what is being spoken around, start communicating. That's how I learned my language as well. It wasn't taught to me, but I acquired it being in that language surrounding. So in my experience as a teacher of the deaf and working in low-income settings, where we've supported deaf children to learn language, to communicate, and also learn literacy, and supporting their families and teachers to learn, to communicate and teach deaf children, I have seen the biggest challenge to be the lack of awareness and information for families and communities. The lack of awareness comes from unbiased and complete information about the different choices that the families and the teachers, in fact, families first, that have for their deaf child. They are the ones to make the choices for their child, but they are unaware and they don't have the information, right information enough to make the right choices for their child. And also the confidence to be given to the parents is lacking, wherein they have the confidence to make a choice, but also to change it depending on the child's learning progress and how the child is doing. So whatever the child needs, keeping the child as the center. So the late identification, like Rose and Joanna both have spoken about in the low income settings, being identified late and not having the right technological support or medical support in these low income settings actually lead to delay in language. So deaf children who lack the benefit of hearing rely more on visual stimulus and input. And this has to be also taken into consideration by looking at the different levels of hearing that each child has. So like any child, when we talk about in teaching, we say that not all children are the same. Every child is different and unique. And that goes the same for every deaf child. So it really depends on the hearing loss of the child and what the child is able to understand and what is the best communication method that is required. But learning a language or acquiring a language, again, depends on the input that is being given to the child. With a lot of consistency, continuity, the richness and the frequency, all of this matters for the child to learn a language. And this language has to be learned before they are ready to go into school. But most often than not, in the low-income settings that we are working with, a child is already ready to go to school, but without any language. And that is where the further delay happens, and it has a compounding effect in their later ages. So there is more to discuss, and I know, so I will stop now and I'll pass you over to Joanna now to call for the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Nita. And I know you've all already met Rose, but perhaps Rose can just introduce herself because she didn't really have a chance to do that before. So thank you, Rose.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanna. As I mentioned before, my name is Rose Kwamboka. I work as the inclusion advisor with Deaf Child Worldwide in East Africa. I am based in Nairobi. It's important to mention that I am deaf. I'm profoundly deaf. And I became deaf at the age of 8 years because of illness. So I can speak, yes, but I'm more confident using sign language. But my first language was a local language. Then I built on it with Kiswahili and English, and now what I use mostly, which is sign language and English. My work focuses on early years language acquisition for the deaf children. And I also want to briefly mention that Deaf Child Worldwide has done research a few years ago, and it noted that most of the deaf children have a language delay of between 6 to 10 years. That means a deaf child who is the age of 10 can have the same language level of a 2 or 3-year-old hearing child. But this is because of lack of the incidental learnings. Because of their deafness, they do not get a chance to learn the words, how to express themselves. And by the time they're joining school, they do not have any language at all. So my work is mostly focusing on helping the teachers in the schools see how best to support the deaf children acquire a language before we start focusing on the school curriculum. I'm very interested to hear from you and to get your questions, and I'm ready to answer them all. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rose. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start with perhaps the first question, because this has come up on a number of occasions, and it's about the need really to be surrounded by fluent users of a language, to learn a language, or to have as much input as possible in the language. But we've also said, obviously, that most of the families we work with are hearing families and don't really understand deafness. So I think, just to start off, interesting to perhaps try and answer a question about what you would say to a hearing family of a deaf child who are concerned because they don't know sign language. And I wonder if I could ask perhaps Daniel to start off with that. And I'm sure others may want to add to what he says. So what advice would you give, or what would you say to a family?
All right, so I think we've encountered similar issues, but our approach to it is to use deaf adults who have been successful in this field. So we call them deaf role models and deaf mentors. And their role specifically is to let the parents understand the prospects that they have achieved when they get the support of their families, and also within the schools that they have attended. So that is the starting line. But sometimes some of the families are very uncertain of what will become of their children, particularly when they are exposed to sign language, and probably the disadvantage that they think is associated with learning sign language. So when we start making them aware that people have gone through the same transition and have been successful, and mostly those who have learned sign language, in addition to that, have, especially those who have postlingual issues, are able to sustain their language and still use them in certain contexts that they prefer. So that is how we will approach it as a team, to make the involvement of deaf adults count, so that they will also appreciate the need to start something for their children.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. Don't know if anybody else wanted to say anything about that at this point. Okay, I think we'll move on to our next question, which has come up, which is about stigma, and the very real issue that I'm sure we sadly have all come across, that there's a lot of stigma associated with deafness. How do we get parents to really understand and feel confident to support their deaf child when there's such a lot of stigma in the local community. I wonder perhaps if you'd like to start us off with that, Nita.
Right. That is a question all of us face with. That is stigma. But parents have to be given information, and it takes time, definitely, to get over that barrier of not knowing what to do first, and then slowly accepting, and then being receptive to the different choices or the different interventions that parents can give at home and in families. It does take time, and from our experience with working with partners as well, it takes years to first get across the willingness and acceptance first. So having said that, one of the reasons could be because the first professionals that families go to is to the doctors. So we don't have the medical fraternity giving all the options that a child possibly has in front of them without bias. That's not given. The first choice that the doctors would give is the medical approach or the medical model approach of fixing the hearing problem through either giving them assistive devices or a cochlear implantation. That is an option, definitely, and that will help. But the time that is spent in the families till these assistive devices are received with the right diagnosis and the right devices that are useful for the child is given, that time is still lapsed and it is lost, where a lot of rich language input could have been given to the child. And every day lost is a negative scorecard, if I may say, for the child. And this is the time where deaf role models like Danny really pointed out come into play, where the families can, without any fear, ask questions about their fears that they have for the child or any questions that they have. So because the deaf person or the deaf role model has lived it and can give information from their experience. So I think that's a way to start bridging the stigma and acceptance.
Thank you, Nita. I wonder could I ask Shana, your perception, do you come across a lot of stigma about deafness in the projects that you work on, and how do you try to help overcome that?
Okay, in our project, we work in rural areas, so there are lots of stigmas, and there are superstitions like these children are result of parents' sin or karma or something. So it's at the first we have to overcome the stigma so that the deaf children can get proper support from the home. And I again give emphasis on the deaf role model that Nita and Danny already mentioned, because as a deaf role model myself, I want to share my experience. When I am visiting the rural area, the parents, they are surprised on seeing me, like, really, you can hear, and you are earning for yourself, you finished your education in mainstream school, so my children can do it too. There's the perfect strategy to overcome their stigma, because when we are saying something, people usually take it lightly. Okay, you are just talking, but when we are showing the example, like it's really possible, they can take it really strongly. So another strategy is like we are showing good evidence from other, not the deaf role model, from other country or maybe some other people, like they have also deaf children and they supported them in a way that the children get educated and they are earning for themselves. And there is like horizontal learning. The parents, they share their experience with each other. They are fearing that I'm facing the problem, and that is sharing I'm facing the same problem. How are you overcoming this? The parents can, the parents can inspire one to another, inspire another. And we have parents working in our project, they are volunteering, they are talking to other parents and inspiring them, motivating them. We are involving the community, and like this, we are trying to overcome the stigmas.
Thank you, Shana. And just very quickly, perhaps, I wonder if Rose has anything to say, because obviously Rose and Shana are excellent deaf role models themselves, but also how do we make sure that children who perhaps have never met a deaf person or whose families have never met another deaf person, what are some of the challenges of that?
Yeah, the challenges that they face is the lack of information. When their child is born deaf or they become deaf at a later age in life, they live in denial. They live in denial. Do not think that my child can be anything, or until they see a deaf person or a deaf adult who's successful. They don't have the information. So at some point in their lives, they end up discriminating even or stigmatizing their own children, not necessarily by choice, but because of lack of information. So it is very important for the deaf role models to come out and share their stories with the parents. I've shared my stories a lot, and I also do what we call a deaf role model day, where we visit schools probably on a weekend, interact with the deaf children there. Because even me, when I became deaf and I joined the deaf school, I hadn't seen any deaf role model or any deaf adults there who was successful. So the first 5 years of my life in the school of the deaf, with no interest in education at all, because I had told myself, from the people I have seen around, for the adults, most of them have very low income jobs. Like they are either cooks or cleaners. They do not see any deaf doctors or deaf professors. Until the last 2 years of my primary education, is when I met two deaf role models who spoke with confidence, and that's when I got inspiration and gave education my all. So without those deaf role models, I do not think I will be here today. So yeah, the deaf role models play a very big role, and it's very important in helping the parents understand more about deafness, about the opportunities that are out there, about their deaf children's potentials, and what they can do in life. That deafness is not the end. Actually, it is the beginning of a wonderful life ahead. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, everybody. I think we all agree how important deaf role models can be, or are. I mean, it's absolutely essential. And we work a lot at Deaf Child Worldwide with deaf role models in all the communities, and they're absolutely critical. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming up, and there's some quite big questions. But I think a question from Australia asks about the politicization of deafness and the fact that a lot of children will be encouraged straight away to have a cochlear implant. I think that is less of an issue in a lot of the places where we work, where I think that is not really an option. But linked to that is a question about, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the screen, is about really how can parents, as somebody asked, how can parents make an informed choice for their child in terms of choosing between deaf schools, and that could also link to choosing between languages or use of hearing technology. I wonder, maybe Daniel, I think at Deaf Child Worldwide we talk a lot about informed choice. I wonder how you would manage that in your programs.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I think one of the main issues that caregivers encounter is the fact that they are not exposed to a lot of information. So in making informed choices, their decisions sometimes are skewed towards what is available to them. So to start with, I think that professionals have to be explicit on the issues, the available options, and the potential benefits that the deaf children will get from in making such informed decisions. So for instance, on our project, we have spoken to some parents who wish their deaf kids could be given the kind of support for them to speak. So it is also up to the professional who is working with such a parent to make sure that you explain the kind of support and infrastructure needed and the benefits in the end. And by that, when parents are making decisions, they know that if I make this decision, this is how. And I think the main issue sometimes has to do with the fact that some people assume that once you learn sign language, then your chances of learning other spoken languages will be hindered. And so if we come back into the issues of role model, we can cite examples of people who have benefited from some of these choices and how far they have gone with the choices that they have made. I think that is one of the surest way that we can assure, and to weave slightly into the issue of stigma. So we have deaf people sharing their experiences of how they were stigmatized some time ago, and now they are not. And it's all as a result of the fact that they share their success experiences with others. And when people begin seeing their successes, then they begin to believe that that is how probably they are also making contribution to their communities.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Johnny. Rose, please.
Yeah, maybe to add on that, on the informed choices, just as Daniel has mentioned, sometimes it's very difficult to make a choice between two difficult choices. But to respond on the question about choosing between the specialized school and the mainstream schools, the first thing a parent needs to do is look at the deaf child and identify their potential, and also identify their level of hearing loss. If a deaf child has a mild hearing loss, and probably will benefit more from the mainstream with little modifications, like sitting at the front, encourage the teachers to speak out loudly, encourage the classroom to speak one person at a time. Just creation of awareness in the school on how best to accommodate the deaf child. They may fit very well in that school, which is closer to them, as compared to a special school, which might be many kilometers away. But the first thing is that the parents need to think about the best interests of the child. They must assess between the two schools and ask themselves, which school will be perfect fit for my child? Then from there, they can make the best choices. And also, it would be good to encourage the children to be involved in the decision-making process. Give them all the information, let them know this school for the deaf is a bit far, but you can get ABCD. These are the benefits from that school. The other school is close to home. Then give the pros and cons of both schools, and then let the child decide which school they would prefer. So yeah, this will help the child make the decisions. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Rose. I think what we've all sort of learned today is that there's lots of different options for children, and it's supporting the children and their families to make the right choices for them. I'm just going to go back to an earlier question, which I apologize, I think we might have missed. Somebody was asking about, and this perhaps comes back to Rose's presentation, asking how, if you could elaborate a bit more on how reading storybooks will help deaf children to develop language. Is it a combination of visual, repetition, and so on? So I wonder, again, sorry, back to you, Rose. I think you raised that as one of the 5 tips, and then perhaps ask others as well to contribute. Thank you, Rose.
Yeah, thank you very much. When you talk about reading of storybooks, especially for the deaf children who are very young, it is important to have a lot of pictures, visual materials, and the storybooks at the beginning should be as simple as possible. Short and simple. This will help the child identify the word and the pictures. They read the story. At first, they may not really understand the story, but the more you repeat the story, the more it starts to make sense to them. Yes, when you help the deaf child acquire language, it may not be easier to understand, just like with the hearing children. When they're still babies, the parents read for them storybooks, but the child does not understand what the parent is saying. But with time, they begin to pick up words, pick up vocabulary, and start to understand the story, and can even narrate it back to you. So to help a deaf child understand the story, read them short stories, even if it's just a page a day. We can also ask questions about what has happened in the story to see if the child has understood what is happening there. And also important to repetition. The more you repeat, the more the story begins to make sense before you move to the next story or before you go to the next storybook. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Rose. Would you have anything to add to that, Nita, at all? Given that you've learned lots of different languages.
Right, yes, absolutely. So learning through storybooks is so key and essential. I mean, learning a language includes reading as well. But I'd like to talk about children who are using sign language as their primary mode of communication, or families who use sign language. It's so much essential for them to read books, because sign language is a complete language. It's really essential to first build the foundations through communication and understanding, and then building the language. But sign languages are not written. They don't have a script. So you are relying on another language to be able to communicate, to learn, to become literate. So that is where we say bilingual approach or teaching, where you're using 2 languages at the same time. So for babies who are using sign language, or children who are using sign language, reading is essential, where families use sign language as a medium for communication, to narrate the story to them. This way, they pick up a lot of vocabulary. Books are a good medium to pick up vocabulary. And like someone asked, if visuals need to be used, or what are the different methods or resources. Demonstrating is a really good way, enacting a story. And then it could be feelings, it could be objects that you can then point out to. So reading initially starts off to be a good way to develop vocabulary. And then later on, when we get into teaching reading and writing, that is into literacy, then we also look at the grammatical structure and the differences between the 2 languages structures. And that's how children then develop to have much better, rich language. So it has to be both languages together, sign language as well as reading and writing.
Great, thank you very much, Nita. And perhaps a little bit related to that, a question that has come up, and I might ask Shana this. There's a question: if a child can't hear, why should you speak the words?
Okay. I'm laughing because that's the most hard question I have ever got. Okay, I always get this. Okay, to hear this with you, I'm profoundly deaf. That means I can't hear anything at all. But you can see I'm speaking, and no, maybe not clearly, but I'm speaking like fluently. So when I lost my hearing, I was a bilingual deaf. I was 7 years old, and the doctor said that my doctor said to my parents that she will surely forget the language because she will not be able to hear anything. But you can see I did not forget anything because my parents never stopped speaking to me. They always spoke to me, and slowly I learned lip reading. Lip reading is something you can understand the other's speech by seeing the movement of their lips, tongue, and facial expression. So ask yourself, if my parents at that time stopped speaking to me, thinking that she can't hear what the use of speaking to her, then I will never be able to develop this lip reading skill, and I will never be able to study in mainstream school because back then in a rural area, inclusive education was just impossible to even think about. And also, if a child is born deaf, if he can't hear anything at all, you then even then you need to speak to him because he will pick up the movement of your lips, and he will somehow relate your expression, somehow relate to your son with that movement, and he will gradually develop the lip reading skill. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Shana. And I'm afraid now we've run out of time. For our panel discussion. I mean, I think we could have gone on a lot longer, but thank you very much for all your insights and sharing all your experience with us. We're actually going to now give everyone a chance to ask questions directly or make comments or have a discussion, and we'll have a short session in smaller groups in breakout rooms. You'll all shortly see something on your screen asking you to join. So if you just press that button, it will take you into a room. There will be there'll be a facilitator there who will explain how things are going to work. But what I would encourage you all to do is when you go into the breakout rooms, please do switch on your cameras, unmute yourself, and really this is a chance to have a bit of a discussion, and there will be members of our panel in the different rooms as well. So we will, if you all go there, we'll be in the rooms for about 20 minutes, and then we'll just come up and do a very short wrap up afterwards. So I do hope you have some interesting discussions. I'm sure you will. Back. I hope you all had some time to have some discussion in the
recording stopped
in the chat rooms. I'm sorry you didn't perhaps have quite as long as we promised, but I hope enough time to just at least meet a few other participants. And we thought it might be interesting for you to see actually who has come to the webinar and to see who's here today. And I mean, we've been delighted to have participants from so many different countries as well. So thank you all very much for joining us. You can see on the screen what some of the statistics are. and also a wide range of organisations, which is great. I think if you just had time to look at that, we are going to ask you one last thing. We're going to do a very quick poll just to get a snapshot of your thoughts on the webinar. It's completely anonymous, so you can feel free to say whatever you like. And it'll just be up on the screen for a short while. I'd be very grateful if you wouldn't mind just filling that in. And whilst you're doing that, I will just remind you that we will be sending you a follow-up email as well, where we will ask you for more detailed feedback, because we want to do more webinars and obviously we want to try and improve each time. So we'd be very grateful if when you receive the follow-up email, you do just take a little bit of time to give us your feedback, and that would be much appreciated. I mean, the webinars are really very short. This is a very big topic, and obviously, you know, there's only time to scratch the surface, but we do have Deaf Child Worldwide does offer some training programs, which you're welcome to apply for. Our training programs are all delivered by deaf and hearing trainers, and we have two main topics at the moment. One is an introduction to deafness, and one is teaching deaf children, and we try to deliver each of those twice a year. So we will message you, or keep if you can keep track on our website, you can see when those are coming up. In some cases, we are, you know, we'd be happy to discuss possible bespoke training if you want to contact us, and the email to contact us on, I think, is on the chat box. So please do get in contact with us, even if you just want to talk a bit more about some of the topics, and we'd be delighted to see how we can continue these discussions, which are so important. So just leaves it to me now to thank you all very much for coming. It's been great. Thank you for your time, and a big thank you to all our panel members as well. We really appreciate your input, and thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us. And I look forward to seeing you all again when we have our next webinar. So thank you again.